How's everyone doing today? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Moradiega, live today on July the 5th, or actually not live, but coming to you guys today on July the 5th, the day after 4th of July. Hopefully you guys are watching this, enjoying your weekend with this show. But on that note, we're going to start off today's show talking some more about the NFC. All the excitement is in the NFC, honestly, now that I think about it. A lot more things going on there than the AFC. With, again, talking about the Hard Knocks episode that debuted on Tuesday, we're going to look more into what was said about Saquon and how he ended up in Philadelphia. Then, the debate about the Cowboys quarterback, with them deciding to pay Dak Prescott, or maybe how Trey Lance is affecting them taking so long to negotiate with Dak, and also taking a look at what Drake London said we can expect from the Falcons offense in 2024, plus a lot more on today's show. So if you guys would, before we start, if you have any questions or comments you ever want to make on this show, you use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. By using that link, whenever you guys are watching the show, I'm able to see your question pop up. I'll read it in the chat box, and that way I'll acknowledge it, read it on air, and have more of a conversation on shows like this. So it's a massive help for the network and this show. So again, if you would, please use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. But with that being said, we'll start with the first segment. More on Hard Knocks. What did we see on Tuesday? And just as you guys can read it there, what were the Giants thinking? In the first episode, like we mentioned on Tuesday, we talked about how they got to the decision of Daniel Jones, making sure that this was his year, that it was a big year for Daniel Jones, and this year was going to be the year to prove it. Was it fair? What did they say about that in regards to Saquon? That was yesterday. We really didn't touch on how the heck Saquon Barkley ended up on the Philadelphia Eagles, and now we're going to talk about it a little bit more. Like I mentioned, debuted on Tuesday, and one of the main things right away that you took away from it was this whole Saquon situation, and there was one scene in particular that has been going all over social media where you have general manager Joe Schoen in a conference room in his office, maybe talking with some other coaches, assistant coaches, other personnel around his circle, talking about Saquon and what they're going to do with him. Are they going to franchise tag him? Are they going to just let him hit free agency? What were they thinking around it? And one of the assistant general managers, Brandon Brown, he brought up a good point around the running back market and just an overall view of it. He said certain positions have high dollar points because they're positions that make an impact. You want to make sure you get the return on your investment. Basically highlighting what we've been saying about the running back market all along. They're a little bit weary about it just because, like he said there in the last statement, you want to make sure you get the best return for your investment. The fear around the running backs, obviously now, similar to Todd Gurley, he suffers with a severe knee injury, and then you paid him all that money at 26, 27 years old, and with them being injured, they're not the same player. Now it looks like a waste, and people are questioning you for making that deal in the first place. So teams are a lot more nervous about that now, and it started with Todd Gurley, and assistant general manager Brandon Brown brought up that point. And then you get into a back and forth a little bit with Joe Schoen talking with, I couldn't find the name, one of the assistants, one of the coaches that he had right there to his side. I'm sure you guys can see it when you guys pull up the full clip, but it was a little conversation that they had, and it went sort of like this. General manager Joe Schoen brought up the point, is it realistic, unrealistic to tag Saquon Barkley again and trade him? They came up to the point where they said it was probably not going to happen. Then the assistant general manager or the other coach said, are we positive no one will pay him that amount of money in free agency? Then Joe Schoen responded with, who would sign a running back for that dollar amount? Basically, wiping that away. There's no way anybody would sign Saquon Barkley, a running back, for $12 million per year. Again, the same assistant said any team with money to spend would probably try and sign Saquon in free agency. Joe Schoen again said there's a lot of running backs in free agency, almost saying, why would they just focus on Saquon, the most expensive option, which is true. He did make a good point, but again, that general manager responded with, are there any other difference makers in free agency? And you look at some of the running backs, Derrick Henry, Tony Pollard, Joe Mixon, I guess, a little bit, but he was traded, if I'm not mistaken. So there are, really Derrick Henry is the main difference maker, in my opinion, that would compare to Saquon. But Joe Shane made a good point. There's a lot of running backs in free agency. Why would you want to spend so much money on Saquon? But that's not the craziest thing about it. Honestly, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here. The fact that Joe Shane said who would sign a running back for that amount applies to 95% of running backs except Christian McCaffrey, Saquon. Maybe that's it off the top of my head. Maybe those two guys are the only two guys, and maybe Bijan Robinson with the potential that he has. But regardless of that, that statement applies to, again, like I said, almost all running backs except the handful that I just mentioned. So that's where I'm confused, and that's where, this title comes from. What were the Giants thinking? It's almost like if you guys have ever seen that trend on social media where the parents have their kids there, they put a cookie or some sort of dessert in front of them and say, oh, don't eat it until I come back. The kid eats it every time, because how could you not? How could you not expect Saquon Barkley to be on the open market, to run that risk in the first place and think, oh, no one's going to pay him. No one's going to pay that amount. He's way too expensive. At 27 years old, mind you, and no one's going to even look at him. He's way too expensive. Why would we even worry about that? It's crazy. It's crazy to think about. Because Saquon, for how right and logical that point is, Saquon, I think, just exceeds that, mindset, that limitation that a lot of teams have. And it goes back to the point of why the Giants, I feel, should have exceeded their own limitations, thinking that no one's going to pay him. Why should we pay him that amount of money? He is one of the few generational talented running backs that we've seen over the last few years. Could you imagine if Saquon wasn't on the Giants the last few years? Where would they be in terms of just any sort of success relative to how they've played outside of him? To say and feel safe about putting him on the free agent market and not considering anything else. He was the face of the entire Giants team for this period since he was drafted up until now. They franchise tagged him. They did everything to keep him, but then when it came to the moment of deciding to pay him or not, they decided against it, as if Saquon hasn't done everything to prove himself that he deserves that amount of money, especially for the Giants to pay him that amount of money. I can see other teams maybe being hesitant because he's really been overworked with the Giants, but the Giants have seen really the behind the scenes of everything and have seen what kind of person he is, how dedicated he is to the team. For them not to offer him anything and just let him walk and think he's going to come crawling back or something is nuts. This conversation is almost another example of how, I don't want to say how poorly it's been managed, because Joe Shane really hasn't been there too long, but it's just another misstep in these decision-making processes that I'm not a big fan of, and it just blows my mind of how, I know a lot more goes into it with the salary and the finances and just figuring out everything. Maybe if they sign Saquon, they can't afford Brian Burns and his extension. They can't sign other players, but it goes back to that point of giving that contract to Daniel Jones. Once you make that, you really handicap yourself to having limited contracts around Daniel Jones, because players that get that amount of money, those quarterbacks are able to do more with players that don't make that amount of money, if that makes sense. You don't need a top-paid receiver to go along with a top-paid running back if your quarterback is that good. You look at Patrick Mahomes, no one around him is making that sort of money, except maybe Travis Kelce, but I think his went down a little bit. Another player, maybe C.J. Stroud, he's on a rookie deal. Joe Burrow, another one. They're in a period right now where they could pay the quarterback that amount of money because Jamar Chase doesn't have to get paid. You see them not spending money on T. Higgins for that reason. If the quarterback is that good, teams feel confident that they don't need to overspend on these positions to complement their quarterback and make them, that much better, as if they can't do it themselves. The Giants paid Daniel Jones like that, but that isn't the case really with him. And now you look at these two decisions that they've made, almost which one looks worse really just popped up into my head at the time of planning for this segment. Was it a worse decision to pay Daniel Jones that money based on everything that you saw? Or was this a worse decision heading into free agency, thinking no one's going to pay Saquon, no one is going to touch him, no one's going to look at him because he's overly expensive in this day and age in the running back market? When you look at those two scenarios, Daniel Jones' contract was bad. that's really what led into everything. But almost all teams are doing it now. That's the trend. Overspend on the quarterback because you're too afraid to pay a different position because the quarterback is everything, right? I hold it to a high value, but I think teams need to stop this mentality a little bit that any quarterback, if you've seen a glimpse of success from him, let's pay him $40 million. Let's pay him $45 million. That needs to at least be, simmered down a little bit. You get into these situations now where it's handicapped the Giants. They're struggling now to move forward, and they did do a good job of drafting Malik Neighbors, finding other talent around him on the defensive side of the ball, and things like that. But again, if that quarterback position isn't 1,000% sure that that's your guy, and you paid him that amount of money, you're in a weird position now where you're stuck until that contract runs out or until you decide to move on in whichever way you decide to do that. But back on this Saquon thing, that it stems from that Daniel Jones decision, and now to come off of that, it's hard because off of that Daniel Jones' contract, you sort of understand why they want to pay Saquon that amount of money, but they're just stuck between a rock and a hard place there. It's unfortunate that they decided wrong with the Daniel Jones contract at first, and now letting Saquon go, seeing him sign with the Eagles, it's just like the ultimate slap in the face for these wrong decisions that they've made. And this year's going to be big. Like I mentioned last episode, General Manager Joe Shane said it. This is the year for Daniel Jones. They feel good about it, and they're going to decide if he's their quarterback for the foreseeable future or if they're going to have to move on. And then you start this process over again, and that's less than ideal for a Giants fan, anybody around the Giants that is just waiting to see this team finally make it over the hump, but they just keep stumbling on their way of finally getting over that. So that first episode was super entertaining. I highly recommend you guys watching the Hard Knocks series. I'm definitely going to try and get into it, but that was that. Those were the two biggest quotes from Hard Knocks in the first episode. Let me know what you guys think. Am I being too harsh, or do you guys see it the same way I do? Leave your guys' thoughts in the comment section. But with that being said, we're going to move on to the next segment after our first break, how Dak Prescott's contract extensions are being affected by Trey Lance potentially. Should the Cowboys gamble on Trey Lance now and give up potentially on Dak Prescott? I'll get more into that and my thought process behind all of it after we return. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.